from Scorsese, and the first point that we wanted to draw from that clip was that there is something that we might call the language of film. Even though language is not the best metaphor to use, I don't think, nevertheless it is a useful one. And the thing we tried to draw your attention to was that the language of film, or the things that shape film meaning, according to things that structure film meaning, are rather more complex than you might realize. And one of the things we're going to do is try to focus your attention on that language of film so that you gradually, it becomes second nature in your film watching to see these different elements. And we drew attention to them. We called them tracks of meaning. There's 6 of them. They are, first of all, the visual elements in film, and the visual elements are made up of mise-en-scene, what is in front of the camera, of the cinematography, that is what it does, and of the editing, that is how you join the footage that is taken by the camera together. Those are the 3 most important visual elements of film. And then fourthly, we said you can't forget sound. Although film didn't begin as a sound medium, it very early on in its history was linked to sound, and now it's virtually impossible to think of film without thinking of the soundtrack as well. In addition to that, we drew your attention, and I keep on getting these things muddled up. In addition to that, we drew your attention to number 5, what I call the discursive mode. What way of it, how does this film address its audience? How does it package its content? And of course, you get documentary films, which have a whole variety of genres, but they are generally documentation of the world around us. And on the other hand, you get, to just name 2 of the possible discursive modes, on the other hand, you get fictional film, narrative film, or what is commonly called feature film. And in this course, we concentrate primarily on feature film and the discursive mode of feature film. Within that, of course, we're going to look at a number of kinds of films, and we're going to look at genre. People are familiar with the term genre, but genre is an element of what I'm calling the discursive mode. How does this film tell its story? What structures does it choose to use? Because if you're following a particular mode, like the gangster genre, there are umpteen ways of telling the story. And you can tell different stories in different places. One of the interesting things that I think when we look at that South African film, which you may have seen, called Jerusalema, is what happens when you take the gangster genre, which is primarily developed in the United States, okay, and you bring it to South Africa, you bring it to the new South Africa. What happens? How does it fit? What can you do with it? What can you make it tell its audience about the new South Africa? Okay. So genre is part of discursive mode, and then after discursive mode, that was number 5, and then number 6 is what I've called, or we've called, the cinematic apparatus. It's not what we're going to focus a lot of attention on, but we just want you to be aware that that is important. And the cinematic apparatus is that industrial structure, if you like. Those money people, those technology people, those distributing people, and those people who own the film viewing facilities and so on. How do they influence what gets produced? And of course that happens with television as well as with film. How does HBO shape its material? How does it decide what is going to belong to the HBO product box, if you like, and what belongs, or what they would regard as in their view, inferior to their preferred offerings. Okay, so we were looking at those elements of meaning, and we had begun with Scorsese because Scorsese talks about the language of film. Now I've gone a little bit back because we have been, we've seen this bit of footage, and I've gone back a bit, and I'm going to replay it because what I want us to do now is see what Scorsese goes on to do next in the same extract from that documentary. Here is how it carries on.
Tools that directors have at their disposal to create and heighten the illusion of reality. When Lillian Gish called D.W. Griffith the father of film, she used the same analogy. She said, he gave us the grammar of filmmaking. He understood the psychic strength of the lens. Half a century later, Stanley Kubrick may have had Griffith in mind when he remarked that what is truly original in the art of filmmaking, what distinguishes it from all the other arts, may be the editing process. Watch how Griffith developed, 2 years before the birth of a nation, the technique of cross-cutting. He shows you two events happening at the same time, and intercuts them to increase the tension of the suspense.
By the way, I don't know whether you noticed when you watched it the first time, Scorsese, not quite correct there. We actually get three events. Do you remember? We get the guy whose business has gone bankrupt, so he's about to shoot himself. We get his wife with the little baby on the phone. Those are the two main events. But in between, we get the guy's partner who's in the car racing along. So in fact, three events are being intercut at the same time.
Now at that time, Griffith had to fight his distributors who feared that audiences would be confused by this innovation. It was in the great epics of the silent era that the illusionists learned to use special effects and visual wizardry to conjure up some of their most compelling visions. The American tradition of the great spectacle was born around 1915 when D.W. Griffith saw Cabiria, an Italian superproduction. Watched it twice in one night. It inspired him, gave him the audacity to create his masterpiece, Intolerance. Giovanni Pastrone's Cabiria had all the right ingredients: adventure, melodrama, pageantry, religion, extraordinary production design, and striking camera angles and lighting. Film this scene, they actually dragged Hannibal's elephants up onto a mountaintop. Intolerance. Much has been made of its extravagant budget, real-size sets, and thousands of extras. The achievement is all the more extraordinary because Griffith worked without a script. It was all planned in his head, not on paper. But Griffith went even further. Intolerance was a daring attempt at interweaving stories and characters not from the same period, but from 4 different centuries. Freely cross-cutting from one era to another, he blended them all together in a grand symphony devoted to one idea: passionate plea for tolerance. Griffith's passion for history was balanced by his passion for simple people, the victims of history. In modern-day America, a young woman is deemed an unfit mother because her husband is in jail. Oppression is represented by society matrons, Puritan reformers who want to place her baby in an orphanage. Griffith's distressed heroines carried with them the heart and soul of the picture. For them, he composed his most eloquent close-ups. Like Griffith, Cecil B. DeMille liked to paint on a big canvas. His ambition was to tell an absorbing personal story against a background of great historical events. His first biblical epic was inspired by one simple belief: you cannot break the Ten Commandments. They will break you. Watch DeMille's masterful staging of the Exodus from Egypt. The visual contrast between the Pharaoh's war machine and the simple caravan of the Israelites. His sense of wonder. His attention to details, even in big crowd scenes. His miniatures were as powerful as his frescoes. DeMille even used an early two-strip Technicolor process here. However, the grandiose set pieces were always subordinate to the story. DeMille knew that spectacle alone would never make a great picture. He spent much more time working on dramatic construction than on planning photographic effects. The audience, he said, is interested in individuals whom they can love or hate. DeMille believed that he could translate the words of the Bible in the medium of film, literally. To achieve this, he devised extraordinary technical effects, such as the parting of the Red Sea. DeMille insisted that every detail be seen with equal clarity. Here, for instance, notice the rocks and seaweed scattered on the sand to make the beach look like the bottom of the sea. It was a last-minute inspiration on the part of DeMille, who led his army of extras into the surf and showed them how to gather the kelp. Of course, I never saw DeMille's silent films when I was a boy. His later epics are the ones that made an indelible impression on me.
Before the dawn of history, ever since the first man discovered his soul, he has struggled against the forces that sought to enslave him. He saw the awful power of nature arrayed against him. The evil eye of the lightning, the terrifying voice of the thunder, the shrieking, wind-filled darkness, enslaving his mind with shackles of fear. Fear bred superstition.
And then there was DeMille's own remake of the Ten Commandments, which I have seen countless times.
There! Where he struck the river! He bleeds! The water turns to blood!
DeMille presented such a sumptuous fantasy that if you saw his movies as a child, they stuck with you for life. The marvelous superseded the sacred. What I remember most vividly are the tableaux vivants. The colors. The dreamlike quality of the imagery. And of course the special effects. God is a unique flame, but the flame is a different color to different people. These were the words of Ramakrishna, which DeMille quoted to define his own faith. The great illusionists of the past, Cecil B. DeMille, D.W. Griffith, Frank Borzage, King Vidor, were conductors. They orchestrated visual symphonies, what Vidor called silent music. It would
Okay, so you see what's happened there is Scorsese has moved from showing us one kind of filmmaking, which is roughly what you might call realistic filmmaking, and then he moves in the second half of that little section that we've watched, he moves into spectacle, or film as spectacle. He moves into film as special effect. And in doing so, what he's trying to do is bring together two elements of filmmaking that were there right from the very beginning. And it's, in other words, two ways in which film, in which narrative film is able to address its audience. Is a film trying to be as realistic as possible, trying to make you feel as if you are really there and this is exactly how things have happened? Or is it trying to be spectacular, to overwhelm you, to use amazing colors and special effects to recreate the plagues that God visits on the Pharaoh in the Old Testament? Okay, so we want to draw your attention right now then to two kinds or two tendencies that are present in filmmaking. Now we are calling them two tendencies because films often do both of them. Often you find a film has both got moments of spectacle and it has got moments of realism, moments of fine detail. I was impressed just looking at this now. I was thinking about, one of the ways you want to kind of convey the immensity of a disaster to your audience. How do you do that? Well, if you can move from the big picture of the disaster or the big events down to a small event, that's one way in which you can impress your audience about both the vastness, the dramaticness of the big events that are happening and the realism of ordinary experience. And it's something that you'll find in many, many films. Up to this day, and why I'm impressed is the way that there's Cecil B. DeMille in his first 10 Commandments is doing something that filmmakers have been doing ever since. I don't know whether you noticed where you got the caravans and the people walking across the desert, and you got those extreme long shots with the kind of ragtag caravan of the Israelites. You got the Egyptians in their chariots with their horses speeding after them, and at one moment he cuts to a little girl standing there. And that kind of cut down to the small detail is a device that I think if you look at many spectacular films, that is one of the standard devices they use to kind of reinforce the spectacular by giving a sense of the ordinary human in the context of that great event. So what we want to do in the rest of this introductory section of the course is to show you two films that illustrate those two tendencies. That on the one hand illustrate what we are, for convenience sake, calling film as realism and then film as spectacle. And we're going to begin by looking at film as realism. On the one hand, film can be viewed as a highly realistic medium that is able to capture reality better than any other medium. one of the reasons why film became so important in the 20th century was because it seemed to have a better grasp of the details of the world than other media. If you read a book, you can imagine what happens. Film can show you much more directly. In the realist mode, and this is, as I've said, this is all available on Moodle now. In the realist mode, film tends to, first of all, emphasize narrative and narrative elements, such as individual stories, interesting characters, and so on. In the realist mode, film tends to use location, shooting, or sets that look like real everyday locations. A lot of early filmmaking was filmed in great big barn-like studios. They didn't go outside. It was too difficult to go outside with the large cameras that you had. It was too difficult to get your sound working outside and so on. So they shot in studios, but nevertheless in ways that made them look like real everyday locations. And when film tries to be realistic, it tends to downplay its cinematography so that the viewers tend to forget that this is a film, forget that they are watching a film. And similarly, when it tells its story, it doesn't want to draw attention to the telling of the story. It wants you to be so absorbed as if you feel that you are there in the situation itself, as if it is so real that you could be there. And it's important for our purposes to recognize that this becomes the dominant mode of filmmaking, and particularly the dominant mode of American-style filmmaking. In the period of the 1930s to the 1950s, this mode is called the classic Hollywood style. And one of the things that we need to understand in this class is what is meant by the classic Hollywood style, not because we are looking exclusively at films filmed between the 1930s and the 1950s, but because the classic Hollywood style becomes the most influential film-making style. There's a huge amount of debate in the film industry in South Africa, well, not a huge amount of debate, but certainly considerable debate about how South Africa should make its films. The National Film and Video Foundation essentially wants South African films to have an international audience and demands that the stories, the way they are filmed, are going to be primarily in a contemporary version of the classic Hollywood style. Other people come along and say, no, well then you're just kind of submitting to the dominant mode, you're submitting, some people at the extremes would say, that's like American imperialism, why should we make films like they make, and so on. But there is that debate, but I'm using that debate simply to illustrate that that classic Hollywood style, or the key elements of that classic Hollywood style, still remain the dominant framework within which people work. And sometimes people depart from that, but it's very hard to understand their films except as a departure from this dominant norm. Now, we're going to look at, in class, we're going to look at an early film, as you can see. It's another silent film by D.W. Griffith. We've chosen it because it is the first gangster film ever made.
In 1912.
In 1912. It was before feature-length films were possible. You would only have a single reel film, so this one lasts something like 14 minutes. Okay, and it's an example, we're presenting it to you as an example of that realist mode. Just before we start, just in brackets, I'm going to put two things, or put links to two things on Moodle. Some of you, especially media students, will already know about early film. And I'm going to give you a link, first of all, to some shorts made by the Lumiere brothers, because they are the realists of early film, and then a link to another short film called The Trip to the Moon by Méliès, because that is a fantasy film, a film about the marvelous and so on. Okay, and so we will, you will be able to just see two other examples of that in, if you click on those links in Moodle. I'll try and get them up this evening. But for now, what we're going to do is go through this. We can't watch it and then go back. We don't have enough time. So we're going to pause every now and then just to draw your attention to some of the elements in the film that illustrate the way in which film can be realistic. So let's have a look at this.
Can I just say a couple of introductory things just very briefly, and incidentally I muted it, so you're going to have to unmute it. This was apparently an enormously popular film, even though the Biograph company put out a gazette every year, and the way they described this film, they said, this film, which doesn't go very strong as to plot, is intended simply to describe the typical activities of gangster type of people. But apparently that's what people wanted. Gangsters were in the news. There'd been, in that year, 1912, there'd been lots of newspaper stories about gang wars on the New York Lower East Side. And what Griffith did was he shot his film literally on location, on the Lower East Side, not in a studio lot. And he cast not only people who looked plausibly as if they might be gangsters, but apparently quite a number of minor gangsters themselves got minor parts in the film. So people loved the movie because they thought it was really showing them the world that they were reading about in their newspapers. So realist in that sense, in that it's intended to be a sort of window on a very real world that people might otherwise not get a chance to see. Was there anything else? No, that'll do for now.
Just a couple of points to make here. You will see throughout this film the camera remains stationary. One of the big discoveries, of course, in filmmaking is that you are able to move the camera, you are able to have much closer shot lengths and so on. If you were filming the conversation between the two of them that they've just had, for example, you would probably have shots of her speaking to him and then of him speaking to her and so on. Here, the camera is still, it's as if Griffith is still thinking at this stage, which is only 5 years before he makes Intolerance. He's still thinking of the film as being like the theatre. When a new medium comes about, people mostly think of it like the previous medium. They're kind of caught in the old paradigm, and they haven't quite yet worked out what the new paradigm can do. That's probably why the only thing people do with digital, mostly what people do with digital media in cinema these days is say, well, let's make films but use digital media, not use the new capacities of the medium. We're still, to that extent, rather like Griffith was at this point. He's thinking stage, we think film when we use digital media. He thinks stage when he uses film. That's the one point to make. And the other point to make is you can see the kind of realism going on here. You can see the ordinary single room that these people live in. You can also see there it's filming real everyday life. And then finally, one of the other things that makes it realistic is that it is positioning the camera as if you were standing there watching. So by and large, mostly what you see is what you would see if you were standing there watching. So you don't see people's feet normally when you're standing talking to them. You see, say, from their knees upwards, or sometimes even higher than that. Okay, so giving us a realistic image.
I could just chip in also at this point. Just keep in your mind an image of this way of representing the bedroom, this ordinary, cluttered, recognizable, realistic little bedroom. Because in the next film that we show clips from, there's going to be, as it happens, a shot of a bedroom. And it's going to be utterly, utterly differently presented. The shot is going to be organized in a way that's so clearly meant to be symbolic and metaphoric, where this is just meant to say, this is what people's lives are like when you're living in a little rooming house on the east side of New York.
Irrelevant in-joke. Main actress in this film became a very famous silent actress, Lillian Gish, and here she is passing her sister, who is also an actress, and who looks rather like her, as you can see. So it's just a kind of, what was your sister's name? Dorothy
So they
Gish.
sort of stop and look at each other like,
stop and look.
who are you? Also, we sort of tend to think that's a postmodern thing, having little jokes that the audience will get that have got nothing to do with the world of the film. But Griffith was doing it way back here.
The angle, very common here, a kind of three-quarter angle onto the scene, because what you get in film, of course, is this movement in depth. If you're just going to have people moving across the screen like that, they're going to be out of the frame too quickly, so you have this movement in depth. And it allows Griffith, and there are lots of shots like this, it allows him to give you a sense of the kind of street life, the teeming street life, and this looks like a sort of Hasidic Jew sitting there reading the Bible, a little girl and so on, as she goes off to take the washing that she's been doing back to the laundry.
When we come to look at the gangster film later in the course, we see that there's certain sort of stock characters that develop in the gangster genre. And one of them is the gangster figure himself, the gangster protagonist, who's often kind of quite cocky, quite full of himself, snappy dresser, very interested in women, certain kinds of mannerisms. This guy smokes all the time, he pushes his hat back. And again, it's really fascinating to see that way before that started developing as a stock character, here you already have an early example of it. The snapper kid, who's this kind of cocky little bantam of a guy, very sharp dresser, absolutely stunned, absolutely amazed because this girl slapped his face instead of responding to his advances. The feisty woman, the feisty heroine, is also quite a stock figure in a lot of gangster movies. Here, a very early example of that. And in every gangster movie that we watch, the main character, the main protagonist, has a sidekick. And indeed, in this very, very first gangster movie, this nappy kid has this perfectly extraordinary looking guy with a black eye who is his sidekick, his closest friend, his constant companion. So Griffith is, as it were, without anything to draw on prior to this, already beginning to put in place, almost instinctively, sort of discovers by mistake or by accident what are going to become stock tropes, stock characters, stock figures in the gangster genre.
But again, also the realistic mise-en-scene, the dustbin, the broom, and so on.
Storytelling not yet being kind of fully developed, because this poor old dear drops dead at this point in the film, and nobody ever mentions it again, ever reacts to it, that plot strand, as it were, the death of the grandmother, just goes nowhere. She's there, and then she dies, and that's it. When the musician comes back, having been robbed, you have this. He's clearly busy telling his wife all about how he's been robbed. Nobody even says, sorry, Granny popped her couch. So, again, you can sort of see how very, very early in the stage of the development of things that seem natural to us, but that actually still had to be discovered and put in place. And one of them is that you don't have a plot strand that goes nowhere, or a character who doesn't seem to have a function at all.
Fade in, he decides, he learns very early on that fade in signified kind of lapse in time, a change in the time frame. So now we're leaving that particular story and we're here in Pig Alley, where all the poor immigrants in New York are gathering. Notice again, I was talking about that three-quarter on, which allows you to get this kind of depth, and allows you to get movement into your space, but it also, of course, puts you there. People, it's as if you're standing there, people are coming past you, coming and going past you again, creating that sense of realism, creating that sense that you are there. This is not a bird's eye view or something, this is you there at the place.
tables in the restaurant.
Into her glass. He distracts her with whatever he's showing her and he quietly drugs her drink. That was also sort of headline stuff at the time. The big scandal was what they called white slavery, which is kind of much worse than black slavery. White slavery means kidnapping 50 little million gish type blondes and shipping them off to brothels in the Middle East or whatever. And clearly this is what, I don't think this is date rape, I think this is what is being implied there, that the gang's business is to kidnap these young women, and the Snapper Kid rescues her from that. But think again how obvious it would be in a later film to do that in close-up. You want to make sure that everybody sees that he's dropping something in her glass, you have a close-up. Griffith was very soon to discover close-ups, but he just hadn't quite yet. So again, so many things that we just think are self-evident, they're obvious, everybody must have known right from the start, had to be discovered, had to be invented. And he does the whole thing in medium long shot.
Okay, I think we're going to stop.
Yeah.
All right, we'll stop there, and you can see the second exciting installment on Monday.
Okay, so showing now. Have you asked anybody what? Yeah, have you asked anyone whether they?
Are we watching a movie today?
I'm not. I've seen Casablanca and I think I have it.
Oh, the screening in Casablanca.
It's just So, artist to artist. I've been taking photographs with my blurred vision and I've been able to manipulate the photographs so that they come out the way I see life without my glasses.
That's like that painter. I've got Renoir or something like that. He had cataracts in his eye and he started painting what he saw and the paintings were like seriously like very bad. Okay, but anyway, carry on.
So my aunt has offered to pay for my operation and the fixing of my retina. I really feel like it's a step in my art. What do I do? Do I get the operation or do I just... Because like there's a difference. You know there's a difference.
I think you should go for the operation. Even
yeah, my eyesight is
because our eyesight deteriorates with age, you know. Our eyesight